All right, welcome back to U.S. History, everybody. I hope you guys are doing great. Thank you for clicking on this video. Today we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is an important lesson in order for you guys to prepare to write your essay. All right, so before we get started, please take out a notebook and something to write with. As always, feel free to pause or go back in this video if you missed something or if you want to take some extra notes. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. So today we are going to be talking about Cuba, right? So we're going to do a quick case study on Cuba. We're going to be looking at the continuation of the Cold War, right? So where we last left off, right? So where we last left off, we were talking about communism versus capitalism, and we were looking at similarities and differences between the two and how the world kind of broke up after World War II. So we know World War II ended in 1945, right? Two superpowers came from the ashes of World War II. We have the United States on one side, represented here by our flag and by JFK. And we know the United States is a capitalist country. On the other side, we have the Soviet Union, which is represented here by Nikita Khrushchev, and their flag, which you can see here, is this red, along with a hammer and sickle and a star that represents the Soviet Union. And we, of course, know that they were socialist or communist, right? So we have these two opposing superpowers. Right, before we move forward, right, make sure to write this down, the domino theory. Okay, so last class we looked into something that was called the Truman Doctrine, right? So a doctrine is a belief or a goal, right, or an idea. And what the Truman Doctrine said was that the United States would try and stop or contain communism from growing, right, in every part of the world. Okay, so we have these two opposing ideas, communism, capitalism. The United States did not want communism to spread, so they engaged in a policy called containment. Containment was simply just containing the spread of communism, right? They also had what's called the domino theory, okay? So the domino theory is an important one, right? So this theory was an American theory, right? And the basic idea behind it was that if one country fell to communism or became communist or became allied with the Soviet Union, then all the countries around it would also fall along the same lines. They would also become communist. They would also align with the Soviet Union, much like the domino effect. Okay, so their idea was that in order to stop, right, a group of countries in a region from becoming communist and becoming allied with the Soviets, right, they had to stop communism or contain its spread wherever it happened. All right, so next, where we're at. All right, so take a look at this map. This is a great map, okay? It shows the world divided between communist, capitalist, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So this is from 1945 to 1960, right? So take a look at the legend here on the bottom, right? In the dark blue, we could see NATO countries, right? We know NATO stands for the North American Treaty Organization, right? And this is a group of countries, most notably in Western Europe and in the United States, Canada, as well as over here, Greece and Turkey. These are all allied Western nations committed to protecting each other, right, and protecting capitalism, right? We see in the lighter blue, right, these are all the countries that are allied with NATO. All right, so it goes pretty far all around the world, right? We see most of Latin America, right, as well as places in the Caribbean, right, are allied with the West. A lot of places in Africa, a lot of them being former European colonies, right? Places in Asia, like places in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia here, in the Arabian Peninsula. We see Pakistan, right, as well as places in East Asia, like South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and places in Oceania, like Australia, New Zealand, and a bunch of islands in the Pacific, right? Opposing these countries, right, are in the red here. So in the dark red, okay, we see Warsaw Pact countries, right? these countries are committed to protecting themselves as well as protecting communism and socialism. So we hear the biggest one, of course, is the Soviet Union, right, which is made up of mostly Russia, but other Central Asian countries as well as countries in the Caucasus. And we have Eastern European countries here. We have Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Western Germany, and Poland, right? Other countries in the lighter red, right? These are socialist countries allied with the Soviet Union, right? So we could see places like Mongolia, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, right? Places in Africa, places in Southeast Asia, right? Most notably, this is French Indochina, was what it was called. But today we see the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, right? And then we see in the pink, these are countries that are allied with the Soviet Union, right? So we see places in the Middle East, we see places in Africa, right? The dots here, right? These are interesting. These are the red dots are countries that were allied with the West, allied with the U.S. and Western Europe, right? But they had communist guerrilla uprisings, right? So we see places in Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Uruguay, right? And the opposite happens in other places here. So we could see Angola and Ethiopia and Afghanistan that had different guerrilla uprisings, right? Now, a few interesting things about this map that we could take away, right? So first, turn your attention over here to Korea, or now the Koreas, right? We can see that in this map, it's past the Korean War, and we see North and South Korea already split into two different countries. North Korea heavily aligned with the Soviet Union, heavily communist dictatorship, and South Korea heavily aligned with the West, specifically the United States. It's a capitalist country, right? Over here, we also see the country of Vietnam in the late 60s and 70s, right? We had a huge uprising there, the Vietnam War that the United States and the Soviet Union were involved with. It's called a proxy war, right? And turn your attention over here, okay? This red island here is Cuba, right? Notice how close it is to the United States, right? So let's get into a little bit more about Cuba. Right? So Cuba is an interesting country for a few different reasons historically, right? If you take a look on the left, we have the Cuban flag, and on the right, we have a man named Fidel Castro, right? So why is Cuba important for us to understand the Cold War, right? Prior to Fidel Castro, Cuba had a government that was aligned with the United States. They were friendly with the US. We've been friendly with them for many years, ever since they got their independence from Spain. The United States has been partners with Cuba. When Fidel Castro came into power, there was what's called the Cuban Revolution. Okay, so this revolution was huge, a big uprising, right? Fidel Castro came to power, and he was a communist. Okay, so he changed the relationship between Cuba and the United States, right, into one of adversaries, right, instead of allies. And then he became allied with the Soviet Union, the other communist powerhouse. Okay, so here's where we first start to see things happening, changes in relations, right? And now we have Cuba becoming a communist country that's allied with the Soviet Union, right? So once that happened, right, immediately alarms were going off in the United States. Why? Because the Soviet Union, right, is no longer, their power is no longer on the other side of the world, right? Soviet Union's power is now 90 miles away from the United States. Take a look, right? So too close for comfort, okay? Cuba is the closest communist country to the United States, right? If you take a look over here, right, the distance between Havana and Florida is only 90 miles away. Take a look at how close Havana is to Key West, right, which is the southernmost part of the United States, okay? Having a communist country allied with the Soviet Union this close to the United States raised huge red flags for Americans, right? They became really worried about what might happen with a country that's friendly to the USSR, the Soviet Union, that close to the United States. That brings us to what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? So this was a secret operation that happened in the early 1960s. It was a CIA mission, right, that was backed and signed by John F. Kennedy, right? The entire idea behind this was to overthrow Fidel Castro and bring in a government that was once again friendly to the United States. So a little bit of background on this. When Fidel Castro came to power, he expelled a lot of Cubans that were not loyal to him. A lot of them fled to Miami. There, they were trained by the United States. They were given weapons. They were given a plan and a mission to go back and invade Cuba in order to take out the government and install one that was friendly to the United States. If you take a look, the Bay of Pigs is here in Cuba, right? So the invasion took off from Guatemala, right? They made it to Cuba and they failed hard. The Bay of Pigs invasion was what a lot of people like to say was an embarrassment. Okay, they were quickly overtaken by Fidel Castro's Cuban military, right? And the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Right, that brings us to 1963, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So after the Bay of Pigs invasion, okay, Fidel Castro decided that he would reach out to the Soviet Union, right, and see about getting missiles, right? See about getting possibly atomic missiles, right, to Cuba. Few reasons for that, right? And this was a two-part thing, would be to protect Cuba from possible invasion from the United States, right? But also on the Soviet Union side, right? A benefit to them of having nuclear weapons in Cuba would be so that they could have easy range, right, to attack the United States whenever needed. Take a look at this picture here, right? It shows the mileage from Havana to big American cities, right? So closest, right, Miami at only 234 miles away, right? That's nothing for a nuclear missile, right? In the mid-range, we have even Chicago at 1,300 miles away, easily a target. Furthest away, Seattle at 2,800 miles away, could still be hit by missiles possibly placed in Cuba. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Once the American people found out that there was the possibility of nuclear weapons being transported to Cuba, it was a huge panic. People were worried, right? People were worried because for a good reason, right? That there's the possibility that they could be literally vaporized by a nuke at any given moment. Okay, so this was a genuine fear that a lot of Americans had, right? So if we look back on this time period, there was even, we do drills in school all the time, fire drills. Unfortunately, we do active shooter drills as well too, right? But we also do disaster drills like tornado drills, right? Back in the 50s and 60s, they did nuclear weapon drills, right? Where they would hide under desks, right? Or practice using gas masks in order to prevent against. So this was a huge national phenomenon, right? So on the left, we have John F. Kennedy, who was president during the time. And on the right, we have Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. Eventually, they came to a deal, right? And that deal was to get rid of weapons in Cuba. Okay. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, it was avoided. It came to an end. Now, the question that I have for you guys is, why did the Soviets remove their weapons from Cuba in the first place, right? What happened? So this is going to be our main historical question, right? For our next lesson, you will be getting 4 different articles, right? 3 of them are primary sources, and I want you guys to read those through, analyze them in order to answer this question: why did the Soviets remove their missiles from Cuba, right? As always, feel free to go back and pause the video, right? And as always, ask any questions. Feel free to email me if you have any questions at all. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will talk to you soon. Make sure to like and subscribe.